All right. Hello, anybody who's checking in tomorrow or later. First couple minutes here is just going to be me getting everything set up, sent out, I should say. I know you can set these things up in advance to, let's see, book club. You can set these things up in advance so that people can click on the link and have the video open, and then the stream won't start for, whenever you schedule it for. I'm probably going to set something like that up. Okay. So I'm probably going to try to set something like that up. I'm also going to be trying to get things a little bit more organized, everything a little bit more, what's the word? Regular. I know that's been a struggle. Been pretty sick, so, split priorities between life and just having fun. I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes. Still not even 6 quite yet, so I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes before things start. If you are watching this back, probably just skip forward a few minutes. I'm just going to be talking shit for a good 5 minutes or so. Not really even talking about the story, just whatever comes to mind. Keep everything going, keep everything moving along. I've just sent out the link, and I'm going to go post it. I'm going to go post it in the groups now. Should have set this up beforehand. I didn't even think about it until just now that I need to go and post all the links. Which is all right, because I said I was going to give it a few minutes before we actually start. I was getting Neil Gaiman's name wrong. I always want to call him Neil Gaiman. I don't know why. Post that. I don't use Chrome normally, so I'm actually not used to all these little differences between that and Firefox. I don't know why, because I still use Google, but I prefer the idea of Chrome's anonymity, or Firefox's, anonymity, not collecting all your data and things like that, but I still use Google for everything else. It looks like 4chan page. It looks like Birds Are Real is live right now as well. That's pretty funny. All right, we're going to get to a few more seconds. I'm just going to start talking, and people can jump in whenever they jump in, or watch it later whenever they watch it later. It's not a big deal. I'm going to maybe leave a comment and say... Let's say 420. Oh, perfect. 420. Okay, now I'm going to start talking. Nobody's watching yet, but somebody might watch later, or somebody might jump in. This week, this couple weeks, we're reading Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I think it's an accurate name as opposed to calling it some collection of stories, whatever. I think Norse mythology, I don't know. I haven't read a million different versions of the stories, but Neil Gaiman's book is a good representation, from what I understand, of the Norse myths. Obviously, there's a long, give me one second. There's a long tradition of these stories being told and retold and told and retold and remixed over and over again, with probably the most famous or obviously relevant one being Thor from the Marvel Comics series and from the MCU movies, where he's now become a pretty popular character, which is, I think, a really interesting, weird thing. Like, imagine if we made Jesus a superhero. It would be, I don't know. It's just a little bit weird. But I think, from what I understand, Neil Gaiman's stories, and he kind of talks about this, I think, in the prelude or something. I think the version of the book that I sent out to everybody doesn't have the prelude included in it. And if it does, maybe I missed it or something. But he kind of talks about the process of writing the book that he went through, which was mostly reading primary sources. Obviously, these stories, when they started out, were not written down even at all. So you can't go back and find ancient writings that you can read off of and create this really accurate modern translation. And he goes into detail about how he kind of cut things up from different stories and added them. So one version, I can't give you exact examples, but one version has events going like this, this, and this, but it doesn't include some really interesting start point, but it has a much more interesting and famous end point. And it might even be the case that the more famous aspect comes from this story, and then the more famous beginning comes from this story, the more famous end comes from this story. He just combines them because neither one of them is correct. Obviously, first of all, there's no correct necessarily way to do an oral tradition like this, but more than that, they're both just pulling from whatever sources they had from talking to people and from reading whatever. So I really like the process that he went through of kind of trying to ignore the more modern reinterpretations of these stories and just pull from the old ones so that people can feel like they're having an authentic experience. Like I said, I've only read a few various versions of these stories, so I can't, and I'm not Norwegian or whatever from that area of the world, so I can't speak to necessarily this being an accurate reflection of every single aspect of the stories. But in terms of, especially what we read, in terms of giving you an idea of Norse mythology, especially if you only have a vague cultural sense of it from osmosis, people talking about Thor, people talking about Odin, TV shows and movies and books that always references these stories. Maybe not as much as Greek mythology, but very, very much up there. I think this gives you a great window into the Norse myths and their, what's the word? I can't think of the word. I'm not going to sit here and think about it, but it gives you a great window into that world, essentially. If you read the sort of intro for the first page or two or something, he talks about all of the different gods and major players that you need to know about, all the different worlds that you need to know about. So he gives you a good definition. So you start off, it's a bit of an info dump, but you start off with a good understanding of this is who this person is, this is their relation to these other people, this is what's going on. You've got the Aesir and the Vanir, and he goes into more detail later on when we hear about the war between the Aesir and the Vanir and the creation of the Aesir and the Vanir, which I actually thought was pretty interesting when I was flipping back through to decide which stories we were going to read. I thought it was interesting that he started with these two stories as opposed to chronologically the beginning of the universe and etc. Like we even hear in these stories about there's a war going on between the Aesir and the Vanir. There's blah, blah, blah. And I am going to do a quick recap of the stories just because I didn't do a narration and I want to make sure that, I don't know, everything's fresh in your mind, I suppose. But I thought it was interesting that he chose these two stories to start out with because in terms of connecting with what people already know, these stories do a great job. Most people know Thor and Odin. Almost everybody knows those two characters, and almost everybody knows, the more defining aspects of those characters. You might not know about Odin's ravens. You might not know about Thor's magical belt that doubles his strength, but almost everybody knows about Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Most people know what it's called because of the Marvel movies. Most people know about Odin having one eye, and sometimes he has an eye patch. Sometimes he's just got the bald eye or the blind eye. And sometimes they show him with an actual like cataract eye, which is a little bit weird, but it speaks to the idea that these aspects of the characters are very understood. So I like that when we read these two stories, we get a good grasp on things that you already know, but you get to see them in more of a traditional context. Obviously, I can't say it's a traditional context because of what I was saying earlier. It's not, some old Viking dude saying this shit to you over a campfire. So it's not the same exact thing. With that said, I like to, in my head at least, consider these the seminal versions of the stories, just because they're the ones that I read all the way through one end of the book to the other, not just reading a story here and there. And I really like Neil Gaiman. So getting into that, I want to talk about Neil Gaiman real quick. Because he's definitely an author that I really admire, and I would like to know if anybody has any recommendations of books that he's written, because I know he's written a lot of stuff, and I haven't read most of it, or books that might go well within Norse mythology vibe or concept. Tell me if you've got anything like that, or if you have recommendations for things that we should read in general. I'm always open to hearing about that. I think the first book I ever read by Neil Gaiman would be Coraline. I can't remember for sure, though. But either way, if you've seen the movie Coraline, it's amazing. I'm not going to talk about it at all here, other than mentioning it, because I actually want to read that for around the Halloween time, unless we come up with something scarier that fits better, because Coraline is actually not even a Halloween story. It takes place in spring. But the movie is a Halloween movie. I don't know. Well, it takes place in spring, but I love stop motion. I love when they do cool things with it. So we're definitely going to talk about that. If we don't read it during Halloween, we'll probably do it during October or something. He's also done American Gods. As a British person coming to America, seeing his perspective on really the part of the world I live in. I live in southern Illinois, right by the Mississippi River, where a lot of that book either takes place or drives through, or it takes place across the country. But it's really not about New York or LA or any of the places that you see. Almost everything in America is set in one of those places. It might be set in some backwater place in fucking Texas, but very rarely. And if they are, it's usually kind of stereotypes as opposed to showing a true representation of what it feels like to live out here in the middle of America. I can't speak too highly of it because I want to move the fuck away. I don't love it here. But there's definitely a really interesting mythology almost of this part of the world that I think he really managed to capture, and bringing in his credentials as someone who can speak about mythology in general really well. I think he did a really great job on that. And the reason I'm talking about American Gods right now is mostly because we're not going to read it in the book club. It's really, really long. For what we're doing, it's like 17 times too long. I mean, it's a normal book. It's a long adult book. I listened to the audiobook, which was about 20 hours or something like that, maybe a little longer, which sounds really daunting. You hear 20 hours. That's a piece of entertainment. But think about a game. A game, 20 hours isn't that bad. It's spread out over a long period of time that you're listening to this thing for. And if you end up working for a couple hours, you've chipped off a good percentage of it. That's kind of the way I always thought of it. If I was going for a drive for 2 hours, then I knew that I'd be getting a tenth of the way through American Gods, for example. And I really wanted to recommend American Gods, especially to Americans, but certainly to non-Americans as well. I think you can get something out of it. Anyways, there's a lot more that Neil Gaiman's written. There's a few more things by him that I've read, but I don't want to go too deep into it. I just kind of wanted to touch on those two things real quick because they're things that mean a lot to me personally, or mean something to me personally, and I think that you can get something from them. So as far as Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology goes, that's right. So we're going to start with Mimir's head and Odin's eye. which shows you the story of how Odin lost his eye. The quick recap version of this is Mimir is the god of all knowledge and wisdom. He lives up on a mountain in a perilous area with this pool of knowledge at his feet that he drinks from every morning. Odin travels there. He says, Mimir, what do I have to do to let you drink? For you to let me drink from this well. I want to be wise. I want to be as intelligent as you are. And Mimir kind of sarcastically says, it's going to cost you your eye. Like, Odin's actually going to do that. But Odin, having spent a lot of energy to get there, he's just like, fuck it. Pops it out, puts it in the well. And then he gets to take a big old drink. And that is where Odin supposedly gets his wisdom and intelligent things from that. Excuse me, positive qualities like that from. Again, the stories are a little bit weird and not necessarily related to one another. Like, if you were one of these people who came up with one of these stories, you were just coming up with a story with characters that you were aware of and a mythology and world that you had lived in your whole life, essentially. So there's not as much pressure to make everything cohesive and have this perfect, what's the word? Can't remember the word for, plot continuity. There's a lot of things that feel a little bit weird. Like, a character dies and then he shows up in another story that chronologically definitely takes place later. Or Odin, who's supposed to be getting all of his wisdom from this cup, but you see stories that take place chronologically earlier where he acts just the same as Odin because he's Odin. He's got his character. For the most part, the gods don't go through really defined character arcs. There are interesting things that happen, though, more so than with the Greek gods, for example, who really don't have any character arc or like change or anything at all. Because we have Ragnarok with Norse mythology, you have a defined endpoint, and the characters can go through a bit of a journey, and the characters can have something that happens to them that fundamentally changes them. And then with Ragnarok, you have a beginning and an end. Most mythologies have a beginning, but then they just kind of say, and the gods are still here with us today. As far as I understand, no Norse person would have thought that Ragnarok had already happened. So they did still feel like the gods were there with them. But I also question how like seriously they took these stories, and I don't even mean just the Norse people, but with a lot of different religions or mythologies over the ages. I kind of question how true they actually thought they were, and whether or not they would spend a lot of time in their daily life worshiping these gods or attempting to interface with that version of reality in any way. I kind of have this feeling that most people live their lives and just kind of live their lives with what's right in front of them. They might talk about mythology or whatever all the time, but for the most part, we don't expect, for example, that God is going to come down and help us with something in particular. We might ask, and we might attribute finishing that product at the end to God, but there's not really an expectation that suddenly everything's going to get better. And there's usually an explanation for that in terms of the canon of the religion or whatever. But with Norse mythology, the gods are such weird and interesting characters that I can't imagine living at that point in time and being like, yeah, I'm praying to these characters and hoping that they come down and help me with my life. But then again, I have no idea what life was like back then for those types of people. So it's just a thought. So we have Odin. He loses his eye. Then he gives Mimir as an advisor to the Vanir. Odin and Thor and most of the gods that you're going to be familiar with are from the Aesir, and the Vanir are sort of another species of gods. They're also gods, but they're not related necessarily. They go into that in another one of the stories, and I don't remember it well enough to try to recap it here for you. But Odin kind of makes the dumbass move of giving his most intelligent person to the other side after the war is over. And then they get pissed off at him because their king, is too reliant on Mimir, essentially. So they kill Mimir. They cut off his head, and they send Odin his head, which, again, dumb move. Odin then brings Mimir back to life because death means nothing until it does. But Odin brings Mimir back. It's not even a big deal. He just does it. It's like a three sentences. Mimir's back to life. Just ahead. And then Odin brings Mimir to the pool and sets his head down in the pool with Odin's eye, sitting there, watching all of knowledge and all of the past and the future for all of eternity until Ragnarok, of course. I just realized I'm still playing music in the background. I hope that's not been too loud this whole time. I was just listening to that before we started. It's a kind of a short story, but it gives you an introduction into Odin, and it gives you an introduction into how he lost his eye. So that's why I like that one. Second one being the story of how Thor gets his hammer, without going into quite as much detail as or taking quite as long as I did with the last story. We have Thor waking up to find his wife has her hair cut off. He immediately knows it was Loki because he just guesses, and he's always right. So he goes to Loki and he says, I'm going to fuck you up if you don't fix this immediately. Loki goes to some dwarves, the sons of Eitri, and he convinces them that, the sons of Ivaldi, and he convinces them that Brock and Eitri, these other two dwarves, are challenging them to a build-off, essentially, where the gods of Asgard will decide who is the greatest builder, and will decide which gift is the best. So each of them has to create 3 gifts. If all these sons are told, one of those gifts has to be beautiful, golden, flowing hair. And Brock and Eitri are a little bit more crafty than the sons of Ivaldi. I think they're meant to be older. And they tell Loki that they kind of suspect that something is up here. Why would Loki be doing this? Loki's always fucking with things. He's always making trouble for people. So why is he the one coming to talk about this? Loki promises there's nothing going on here. Don't worry about it. And so that he agrees that if they win, they get to keep his head. I'm not really sure the logic behind this, but that's what happens. If they win the contest, Loki's head is forfeit. So he has to now decide, how am I going to stop these guys? And he figures out that the best way to do that is to repeatedly bite the dude, one of the dwarves, while he's working the bellows, so that the end product will end up being imperfect, because it's a magical item. The forge just has to be kept at the perfect temperature the whole time. The first 2 go off without a hitch. Brock, I think, is the one that's working the bellows, is getting bitten all over, and he's just kind of dealing with it. The third time, Loki bites him on the eye, and the third gift ends up wrong. It doesn't look right. It's not perfect. They take him to the gods, and the gifts were presented are, I'm going to try and do this off the top of my head. The sons of Ivaldi bring a what's the word? A ship that can fold up like a cloth into the size of a cloth that you can put into your hand or into your pocket. They bring a what's the word? A spear that will always find its target, and when you swear an oath on the spear, the oath will be unbreakable. And they bring one more thing, which I've forgotten. I don't remember. Brock and Eitri bring a boar that is made of gold and can fly across the sky, pulling a chariot. They bring a magical armband that will, every 9th night, it will drop 8 identical armbands from it, like drip out of it somehow, that they can give out as gifts to people. And he brings a hammer called Mjolnir, which is the hammer that Thor has, where he can throw it and it'll come right back into his hand. I believe it also has auto-aim, essentially. And it can change size. It can do all these wonderful things. And the one flaw that it has is that the handle is too short. So that's why when you see depictions of Thor and he's carrying around this hammer, he looks like he's got. It doesn't look like a warhammer. If you know anything about what a warhammer looks like, it's got a little tiny head and a big long. What's the fucking word for that? I don't know. It's got a big long thing on it, and Thor freaks out. He loves the hammer. It's the best gift because they can use it to defend themselves from the frost giants, who are their mortal enemies. And the other gift was Sif's hair. Duh. I don't know why I forgot that one. It's kind of the whole impetus for the entire story starting. But it's way better than Sif's golden hair, and nobody even kind of remembers the reason for this. So they say, Loki, we're going to cut your head off now. That was part of the deal. Loki's his out here is that he didn't say they could cut his neck off, only his head. So somehow that works, and they're not allowed to cut his head off. But because the head is still their property, the dude is allowed to put a piece of leather over Loki's mouth and then punch holes in his mouth and then sew his mouth shut so he can't talk anymore, which obviously gets undone. Loki's constantly getting comeuppance, and then by the next story, he's back to his old shenanigans. There's a lot of status quo reestablishment in any ancient mythology like this because, like I was saying, these stories are just being written by people who are familiar with the world. So they just take the status quo and write a story about what happens. Yeah. So that's the end of the story. And as I'm getting there, I'm kind of realizing that beyond pushing people to talk about it, or pushing people to read it, and talking about why I like these stories, I don't really have much to say about them. Again, they're very basic, simple stories. If you know anything about Norse mythology, these are really the foundational stories for understanding it, with major players like Odin and Thor setting up their kind of dynamic, and their and Loki, obviously, that would be the other one that sets up really well. It shows you that he's crafty, it shows you that he's always in trouble, and it shows you that everybody knows that he's an asshole. That's the big thing with Loki. It's not like he tricks you because you think that he's this benevolent guy. It's that half the time, the things that he comes up with are really good, and they help everyone, and everyone loves it, and everyone benefits from it. And the other half of the time, he's fucking with you, or lying to you, or pulling a prank. So they go along with Loki because sometimes he is actually helping them, but every time something goes wrong, they immediately know that it's him. And there's a whole reason that they can't just kill him that they go into later. Essentially, Odin has sworn to never kill Loki. Or I think even allow any harm to come to him. Which comes a little bit... comes into play a little bit later in the series, where we kind of find out about the fate of Loki. So I definitely do recommend, if you enjoyed these stories, if you enjoyed Neil Gaiman's rendition of them in particular, as opposed to seeking something else out, that you go ahead and read the book. It's very short, not short enough really to do a whole thing here, unless we go story by story, which I'm happy to do. But like I said, I don't have that much to say about at least these stories. I might have more to say about some of the other ones. It's a lot harder than with something like... what's the last one we did? New Pittsburgh, because I don't have as much cultural context for them. I can't tell you about why the author did what he did and said what he said. I can't tell you about why I think this is relevant to this and this and this. It's really about more of an interesting story to tell around a campfire than a critique of society and things like that, where I can really get into it in a discussion. I just kind of wanted to have something that would push people to read something fun, push people to read something hopefully that's different, that's not something that you would have read necessarily without having it presented to you. I know I wouldn't have if I hadn't had it presented to me a while ago. Just had someone say, hey, check this story out, you really need to read it. And then, I realized, hey, it's Neil Gaiman, he's really good. But next week, we're going to be back with Control. I'm sorry. called Override, not Control. That's a different. There is a story in the same universe called Control, but that's totally separate, and I don't even remember what happens in it. And it's not part of the corpse handler thing. We'll probably never get to it unless this goes on for a very long time and I start looking for random shit like that that I don't even remember. But we are going to be back. We're going to be back with Override, and I am looking forward to that one. I think it's probably going to be the best one we've done so far in terms of the live stream and the discussion for it, because I have more to say. I have a lot more to work with in particular. Go ahead and look out in the book chat, and I'll post it on Facebook and things for the link to that. I'll post it in the comments here as well. Leave this page open so I can have it in the comments. The link for Control, Override. I'm sorry. And we're going to be back again talking about the Corpse Handler trilogy and George R.R. Martin. And then after that, I'm not sure what we're going to go to. I've had some people say that they would rather stick with Corpse Handler than go back and forth. So maybe we'll just go straight into Meat House Man, especially if people like Control and things are going smoothly. We might just move straight on to Meat House Man and finish that up. That was really the one that I had originally planned on doing for the first stream. But I think we'll have fun with it, and I think we'll enjoy having that context built up over the previous two stories. Yeah, sorry for the short live stream, only 30 minutes, but I don't have much to say other than like a bit of a recap, like I said. I do hope you guys enjoyed the stories, and I hope you guys are enjoying the book club so far. Like I said, we're trying to push out some new ideas and new get everything a little bit more structured and organized, but that probably won't settle in for a couple more months or weeks or whatever, and that's fine with me. Just want people to have fun. I just want people to read stories and enjoy them and talk about them. So let me know in the comments what you thought, and have a good day.